Advanced Persistent Defenders, APD. It's time to level up our game. Now, what are we going to talk about in this session? Well, we're going to cover the pyramid of pain. We're going to get a good understanding of the opportunity as defenders. Then we're going to move to the Mitre attack framework and get some insight in what it is and how it may help. And then we'll move into the attack navigator. We'll do some scenarios and drive some outcomes, get a good understanding of our coverage model. And then we'll move into some adversarial emulation. We'll do some testing. We'll look at some output in regards to that test and determine where we need to add coverage. Let's get started. Why do tactics, techniques, and procedures matter? Well, let's look at the pyramid of pain as an example here. We've got hash values, which are trivial for the adversary to overcome. We have IP addresses that are easy. We have domain names that are simple. And then network and host artifacts become annoying for the adversary to overcome. And as we get higher in the pyramid, it gets more difficult. Tools become challenging, and techniques, and procedures are tough. So mitigating and defending at that layer obviously makes it very, very difficult for the adversary to be successful. Now let's just walk through this a little bit. So let's drill into this analysis by Talos around ransomware Tesla Crypt. Now, we can see a bunch of hashes here. And the hashes are trivial for the adversary to overcome. So why? Because it's easy for the adversary to overcome the hash that you're blocking. And so if you take this list and you put it in, you're going to block everything that's known. And if nothing changes, you're good to go. But if the adversary wants to make a change, it's as easy as using something like MSF Venom and having the ability to create a new payload that has a new hash. Now, could you do this dynamically? Certainly. So as the example here, I've got the ability to do a reverse shell, and it's malicious. And if it was known to be malicious, it would be blocked. Adversary can change that hash. Running the exact same command in this example, I've got a different output. So this becomes fairly trivial for the adversary to overcome. It's a control needed nonetheless, but it is certainly easy for the adversary to overcome. Now let's look at IP addresses. We've got a list of IP addresses here. We can go ahead and feed that into our controls, whether that's through a dynamic feed that comes in or we're manually adding these into our controls. The bottom line is that known malicious IP address, blocked, done. Adversary uses something like fast flux that's fronted by a domain and a list of IP addresses that it continues to rotate through. Now, could you have technology to help you identify this? Certainly. But if you're taking the IP address and you're blocking it, as long as nothing changes, you've blocked that threat. But most likely the adversary is going to overcome that control, and they're going to do it fairly easily. Fast flux is an example of that. Now the control, again, is bypassed. Now we move up higher in the stack. Now we're into domain names. And so again, known malicious domain, quite easy to block and add that control. Again, this is going to be through some type of intelligence feed or manual intervention, but you will add it to your control. But what happens if they're using a domain-generated algorithm and they're changing up that domain constantly? Now, can you reverse engineer the algorithm to predict the future domains that are going to be in that list? Certainly can do that, but you can't always do that. And therefore, the control that you have, again, will be bypassed. So you can see, at least for hash values, IP addresses, and domain names, controls I'm not saying aren't worth adding. They certainly are. They're going to get rid of a lot of the noise. They are going to block stuff. But the adversary is going to be able to overcome them fairly easily in comparison. Now, as we continue to move higher up in the stack, we get into network artifacts. Now, network artifacts is the ability to observe network activity that's being created by the adversary. And this could include things like URI patterns, C2 information that's embedded into protocols. You've got distinctive HTTP user agents, SMTP mailer values, etc. And this example is showing where they're reaching out to an HTML page. The domain happens to be blocked here, and that page is no longer available. can't access it. And so that control is in place today. Now let's assume a few things here. Let's assume that they're using some type of DGA, so domain generated algorithm that reaches out to this domain that accesses this HTML page. And maybe there's an exploit kit here or some type of adversarial element to their attack chain. And so we've been able to reverse engineer the domain generated algorithm and predict the future and therefore block any attempted connection to any of those future domains. So that's pretty neat. We've got that control. Why it's annoying for the adversary is having to go back now and redevelop the malware with a new and improved domain generated algorithm as an example, or a completely other method. But you can see here that now I've got to take some time. I've not only got to recreate it, I may even have to find ways to redistribute the payload. I could use maybe the existing capability that I had in the past if it was successful. But there's a good chance maybe some of those other lower elements have been identified now as well. Anyways, you can see how this could be annoying for the adversary because now the cost of doing business on their side has increased. And the control is bypassed. Once they get this in place, they start rolling it out. Maybe we can't reverse engineer this DGA and can't predict. And therefore, this particular control is no longer suffice. Now we look at the host artifacts. These are observables, again, caused by the adversarial's activities. Now this could be on one or many hosts, and it could include things like registry keys. It could be values known to be created by specific pieces of malware, files, and directories. And so you can see the content here. We've got some indications of compromises, and it includes things like, registry entries, mutexes, files, and or directories created, etc. And so if you're looking or trying to mitigate certain areas here, as an example, one of the references, HKey, current user, software, Microsoft, Windows current version, Action Center. And in fact, what it does is it gets rid of any notifications here. For example, if I was to disable your antivirus or anti-malware capability on your asset, Windows has the ability to say, hey, important message, this is disabled. If I can get rid of that notification, obviously I'm under the radar a little bit here. If that's something that you're looking for to identify whether or not there is an indication of compromise, meaning that this has now been disabled, fair enough. That might help you discover and determine that you have been compromised. Now, if the adversary wanted to overcome something like this, or you had a block, some type of check and balance that didn't allow this mechanism to take place, and again, this is a very trivial mechanism, but the example's the same. I've got to programmatically make the changes within the malware itself to not introduce this indication of compromise, right? Or this additional noise that could be detected from the defender's tool bag. So again, difficult. Just like network artifacts, they fall under the same category here as annoying. All right, tools. This is where it becomes challenging. So this example here could be, in order for me to effectively encrypt the asset, I need to delete all shadow copies. So I have to have the ability to go in and ensure that you have no means of recovery. And therefore, when I do encrypt the drive, I have the ability to enforce that ransomware, right? I'm in a better position for you to pay. Now, if I do something as simple as remove local administrator access from user John, from having the ability to manipulate shadow copies using VSS admin on a Windows asset as an example, or I have a remote capability that does this mechanism and it's controlled remotely and they don't have privilege to make change, it makes it difficult again for the adversary, right? It's a tool that it requires administrative privilege, and if I revoke that capability, the adversary is not going to be able to stop recovery. And so from their perspective, they're going to need another way to impact or force payment. And that's difficult, right? Because if you're not locking up the box, then what do? Maybe then you move to extortion, right? And then now I need to rewrite malware to maybe upload or search for personal data. Maybe that was part of the malware initially, but let's assume it wasn't. It was really around ransomware and encrypting the drive, not extortion. So if I have to go back and redevelop and recreate the method that I'm using to make the victim pay, again, very costly. And in this case, the control is irrelevant. So when the adversary changes their methods here, then the existing control that I may have had in place doesn't matter here. But again, the effort on the adversary side is quite high. This is an example of this ransomware detonated in a sandboxed environment. And you can see very quickly, it not only talks about the behavioral indicators, but more importantly, the Mitre attack alignment around the tactics that are being used in these behavioral indicators. Obviously, this then allows us to pivot and understand more about that attack at the tactic, technique, and sub-technique level. But it gives you good perspective that there is TTPs here that I could focus on. So why are TTPs so valuable for defenders? This is how the adversary goes about accomplishing their mission. This includes things like reconnaissance all the way up to data exfiltration and every step in between. This is the how. And so if I'm able to mitigate the risk here, it makes it very, very costly for the adversary to overcome. For example, TeslaCrypt and its variant AlphaCrypt have to encrypt the drive, right? And this gives an example of the impact here. Data encrypted for impact. This is the sole mechanism here, or one of the core mechanisms here. And if I'm able to understand the impact, the technique is data encrypted, that's the impact. And if I can mitigate their ability to encrypt that drive, it's very, very difficult for them to overcome. So an example of that might be that maybe the tools on the box still exist. I can't get rid of WMI or PowerShell. In this case, I can't get rid of shadow copies. These are important mechanisms for my operation. And so I can't completely get rid of them. But what if I had a tool that does detect the behavior when encryption starts? So it identifies that files are starting to be encrypted. One or two may get encrypted, and then it stops and kills that process automatically. So now I have been impacted, but very minimal. I've got a couple of files that are encrypted. I got my VSS backup. I've got my shadow copies. I can do some restoration here. I've got my offline tools that can do some restoration, but very, very little impact considering. And I've stopped the adversary from fully encrypting the entire asset. And again, if the more that they encrypt, the more operational burden it is on me to do the restoration, right? How old is the data? All those other challenges start to come into play. But if I'm able to kill it early, only at a cost of a couple of files, how does that adversary overcome that? Very, very difficult. So that's why TTPs are so critically important. So if they bypass that IP, that hash, that domain name, the artifacts, the tools, the tactic and technique are still the same. Very hard for the adversary to overcome. Doesn't matter about the IPs and the hashes and the domain names now. Now, I'm not saying those controls don't exist. You certainly want those controls, but you can see if I have the ability to move up in the stack, I make it very, very difficult. And so now for the adversary, in order to be successful here, they need to find another way. What's that other way? Well, there's all kinds of other ways. Maybe now they want to just steal credentials. And so they have to recreate their malware to include things like Mimikatz or Mimikatz-like to be able to harvest credentials once they get a hold of that asset to elevate privilege, have the mechanisms that they might need, and they might not have the ability to do ransomware, so their mission has changed. So now they might be looking at extortion, looking for intellectual property, personal data, and using that to get an advantage over the victim in hopes they'll pay. Or maybe they just cause harm and outage and disruption. Either or, very, very difficult for the adversary because encrypting the drive is going to be very, very difficult. So when we look at this particular threat, we can see all the different tactics and techniques the adversary is using. And so we can shore up our capabilities. So what are some of the benefits? Well, defending at the TTP level increases the cost of the adversary to be successful within an organization. They have to make some fundamental changes in order to overcome them to achieve their objectives. It also provides time-based defense, meaning that there's an opportunity for them to trigger additional alerts or alarms because it's going to take them much longer to be successful. And that buys us time. That's the opportunity as defenders. And then finally, this does not exclude those lower level controls. Those still provide defensive capabilities, and we're not dismissing them. It's just if you move higher up in the stack, the opportunity becomes significant for defenders. So we've got all these tactics, techniques, and procedures. How do we formulate a plan to truly understand all of these TTPs? And this is really where Mitre attack framework comes in. So let's get a good understanding of Mitre and Mitre attack. So Mitre Corporation is nonprofit, it's US based, it's funded federally, it has public and private partnerships, including cybersecurity. These are the same folks that brought the CVE database and the CWE program. Now, CVE is the Common Vulnerability Exposure Database, and CWE is the Common Weakness Enumeration. Now, Mitre attack is really focused on the adversarial's tactics, techniques, and provides common knowledge based on real-world scenarios and putting it into this common framework to share with anyone. It's nonprofit. It was born in 2013. It's globally accessible knowledge base driven by the community itself. It's used to develop specific threat models and methodology to support both public and private sector, and cybersecurity manufacturers and vendors will leverage it within their products or service portfolio. Now, it focuses on the adversarial's perspective. So the who, their goals, the why, and the methods used, the how, in order to achieve a certain outcome or objective. So where is attack being leveraged? Well, we can use it in red teaming, we can use it for gap analysis and assessment, and for adversarial emulation. So what is a threat? Well, a threat equals a capability, an intent, and an opportunity. And so with a capability, it's about the adversarial's tooling, their skills, their education, it could be supply chain. So as an example, an adversary develops an undisclosed exploit, increasing their capabilities. Now, the problem with this area is we've got no real control over this, and we need to understand the adversary's knowledge in this space. So what are their capabilities? Intent is the adversary's motivation, so their intent and willingness to target an organization. Now, this could be profit, espionage, impact to supply chain, hacktivism. Again, we don't have any control here, but we need to understand the intention of the adversary. Once we have a good understanding of that intention, we can start building out our plan to defend. Now, the opportunity, this aligns to the timing and knowledge of the target. So this could be vulnerability, 0 days, time of business, and we have an opportunity as defenders to apply a control to limit this opportunity the adversary has over us. So this could be in the form of patching, network segmentation, application control, multi-factor authentication. All right, let's go through an analogy here. So we've got an adversary, and the adversary is going to try to gain access to people's homes, and they're going to use fake credentials and impersonate somebody from an energy company. And so they'll knock on the door, and you'll look through the window, and based on a level of trust, because you see the badge, it looks legit enough that you open the door, the intruder gains access. And at that point, you're compromised, right? They could rob you, steal, whatever they wanted to do at that point in time. And so the adversary then moves on to another neighborhood, again, has these fake credentials, knocks on the door. You open the door based on the trust. The intruder gains access. This is the second time this has happened. Now, police have been informed, and they're trying to educate the community around this. So they're letting people know there's a robber or adversary portraying to be from an energy organization, and they're building a level of trust to gain access to your home, leveraging fake credentials. If you look at it from a Mitre attack framework perspective, the robber's the adversary. The tactic being used is to gain access to the home, and the technique is those fake credentials to build trust enough for you to open the door so they can access the residence. And now they start educating the community. So now this happens in another neighborhood. The adversary knocks on the door. Everything looks legit. They look through the window. but the homeowner realizes that there is this campaign and doesn't open the door and communicates a little bit further, asking for additional, evidence that they are who they say they are, the adversary may get scared at that point and just move on. So we don't open the door, and we may call police, and at the end of this, the adversary's caught. We shut down their ability to be successful here. And Mitre ATT&CK's going to do the same thing for us when defending against the adversary. Now let's look at this from a different perspective. The periodic table. Now, this is one of the most important tools in chemistry. It describes the atomic properties and every known chemical element. It includes things like the atomic numbers and mass and relationship between each element, and they arrange it in columns. So I have all of these elements, or the ingredients, and I can use these ingredients to drive a specific chemical response. So, for example, if I take hydrogen times 2 and oxygen, I get H2O, which is water. So think of Mitre ATT&CK framework very, very similar in the sense that we've got these tactics and techniques that the adversary is going to use. It's going to be a collection of capabilities to drive a specific outcome. And that's the Mitre ATT&CK framework. So it organizes the adversary's behaviors into a series of tactics. Now, these tactics are things like reconnaissance, initial access, privilege escalation. There's 14 in total when you look at the enterprise matrix within ATT&CK. But each tactic then supports a number of techniques. So how do I achieve the outcome? Remember, the tactic as the adversary that's trying to rob the homes was to gain access or entry into the home. The technique was to build trust, leveraging that stolen credential or fake credential that they created. Same thing with the adversary when it comes to systems. They're going to have techniques, which is how the adversary achieves the overall objective. So this could be the description of the method used, system or platform it applies to, adversarial groups, if known, mitigation capabilities that are published. All of that's going to be included within the matrix itself. And then it's got common knowledge and procedures around that. So this is being shared based on real-world experience. It's highly detailed. And so when you look at a tactic, it's privilege escalation. This is the adversary's ability to gain higher level permission so they can do stuff on the system. And then the technique would be, in this case, boot or log on auto start execution. And the sub-technique could be the registry run keys or startup folder. And so here's an example of the Windows registry where they would enter something that would help gain or elevate privilege. Or, you could also use this for persistence as well. So the goal here is to change our focus. It's not to ignore these lower level indicators. We're certainly going to continue to do that. So these IOCs are the symptoms themselves, but they do mitigate risk. And so we'll continue to do that. It's just, as shown earlier, the adversary can very easily overcome these. And this is why we want to move higher up into the stack. And TTPs, this is where the problem lies. If we're able to mitigate at the tactic and technique level, it's very difficult for the adversary to overcome. Now, the challenge that we have as defenders, this is not easy because it is prone to false positives and negatives, and you need additional context. For example, if PowerShell is being used to move laterally within the organization or pull down a payload, and the goal here is to remove PowerShell, but you use it for administrative purposes, well, that's a problem. We may not be able to leverage every tactic and technique and build a defensive capability. We may need detection only, where we're not mitigating the risk, but we're able to identify if it's being exposed. But there's other opportunities within our attack framework to ensure that the adversary is not going to be successful overall. So again, like anything, they have to be successful in every step in the path. If we disrupt any part of that path, it makes it difficult for them to overcome, especially if we're at the TTP level versus the IOC level domains, our addresses and hash values. What's inside ATT&CK? Well, they've got 14 attacks as of November 4th, 2022. There's 193 techniques, 401 sub-techniques. There's 135 groups the adversarial groups that will take advantage of these tactics, techniques, and sub-techniques. And there's 718 software applications identified as well. There's 43 mitigations. So again, it not only talks about how the adversary is going to take advantage, but also our ability to mitigate. Now, it includes matrix from enterprise, mobile, and industrial control systems. Now, it's fed with open source threat intelligence, blog entries, Mitre research and development, community feeds, vendors, etc. They're all feeding and helping support this model. Remember, it's community driven. Now, key platforms, as I mentioned, enterprise, and this can get even broken up further with operating systems, cloud, containers, networking, and then you move into mobile, which then could be broken down to iOS and Android, and then industrial control systems. Now, mitigation side, we have things like sticks and taxi, Navigator matrix, which we're going to talk about, and then open source tools as well. Now, sticks, example here would be a threat actor relationship, which would be attributed to a certain campaign. So again, you can take that feed data out and ingest that into your defensive capabilities. Now let's talk about the model itself. So you can see on the left here, we have a group which uses software and a technique or implements the technique that accomplishes a specific tactic. I'm going to break this up even more, but for example, the group would be APT33. They leverage Mimikat, so that's the software, to dump the credentials and hopes to gain credential access. And then you have mitigations that are tied to it, and these are all labeled, and you can search within the Mitre attack framework and get deep insight into every one of them. The software, the adversarial group, the actual technique, the tactic, and the mitigations. So we've got the adversary that wants to gain credential access. They use Mimikatz, and they dump the LSA secrets from the Windows platform, and the game begins. So let's jump into a demo and do a quick overview of attack. All right, let's check this out. We're at the main page of Mitre here. Now, we've got these matrices that we're going to look at, and it focuses on very specific areas around enterprise, perhaps Windows and Mac OS. You've got Linux and cloud is broken up by IaaS and SaaS and Google Workspace and a couple others. You've got networking containers. Then you've got mobile that includes Android and iOS, and then ICS for industrial control systems. Each one of these are a little more focused on how the adversary goes about compromising an organization. Now, tactics, this represents the why of the attack. Now, this is the adversary's tactical goal. This is the reason why they're performing a specific action. So, an example of this, an adversary is trying to gather information about the organization and plan to use it for future operations. That's reconnaissance. You've got resource development, initial access, execution, persistence, and it goes on. And each one of these then would contain techniques. Now, techniques and sub-techniques are the how. This is how they're going to achieve those goals. So if they're trying to achieve credential access, then there's going to be certain steps required in order to achieve that outcome. Now, this is an example of boot or log on auto start execution. That's the technique. It also includes persistence and privilege escalation. It talks about the operating system that's included. They also have these sub-techniques that are specific to drive that outcome. Now, each one of these provides a tremendous amount of detail. Talks about the procedure examples, includes mitigations, detections. So this particular attack is very difficult to mitigate against. But there's a couple of detection capabilities that are highlighted here, as well as some references that you can refer to get better insight to exactly how an adversary may go about leveraging this particular technique / sub-technique. We've got data sources. This includes information that is collected by sensors and logs. They help identify specific properties and values of data source relevant to attack, and this builds the technique and sub-technique. So you can see Active Directory, application log, assets, certificates, and then you've got mitigations. So it's good to understand all of that things the adversary can do to compromise the environment, but we also need to understand how to mitigate that. And then we've got groups. So these are the adversarial groups that have been identified. And you can research each one of these to understand the tactics and techniques that they use and the organizations they typically go after. You can build out your controls and detection capabilities to help minimize the risk from that particular adversary. Now, this is an example of Deep Panda. It talks about where they go after, the details of software, etc. Now, software tools that are used, whether they be commercial, operating system, utilities, and so on, that the adversary is going to leverage. You have campaigns. These are where we track intrusion activities using various methodologies. This includes things like operations, intrusion sets, and campaigns. We've got lots of resources in the tool itself. There's blogs, you can contribute, and you can search. So if you're in a specific vertical or looking for a specific group, you can start typing in what it is that you're looking for, and it'll start populating, and you can pivot into one of those search criterias that you've created and very quickly get a good understanding what it is that you're looking for. Now, as we scroll down here, let's check out APT39, and we can see that it's got all the details around techniques used, associated group descriptions, but we can actually launch this into Navigator. We're going to get into this a little bit later, but it highlights the tactics and techniques that this particular adversary uses. And so now what I can do is get a good understanding of how the adversary operates, and based on that information, I can then determine the controls I have in my environment that'll help mitigate that risk. And where I don't have controls, I'd either shore them up or ensure I've got detection capabilities to identify if an adversary does take advantage of that particular tactic and technique within the organization. Really cool stuff to help you build out threat-informed defense. So that was a good example of the Mitre attack framework focused on enterprise. Let's dig into this and build a threat picture and identify the gaps within our organizations based on the verticals and threats that mean something to us. So we saw the matrix, but we're really going to peel back this and do a full analysis of a threat based on 3 criteria. I'll get to those in a minute, but first and foremost, we've seen that very quickly we can come into the Mitre attack framework. We can search up specific data points that are of interest to us. It could be finance, education, it could be software, a threat actor, doesn't really matter, but we can look at it and then build out this matrix to identify the tactics and techniques that they're going to leverage, and then identify potentially the gaps that might exist within the organization and hopefully address those. We might just start with one threat group, like Deep Panda, the example here, and build out our matrix and then build upon that. We can build layers, and we're going to get into that in a moment. Or we can look for a specific vertical and focus on, adversaries that are looking to target a finance or educational-based institution. Now, once we build out the matrix within Navigator, we can then add additional layers as mentioned. And we're going to walk through this in the demo very, very shortly. But the goal here is to add additional layers. So you might start with Deep Panda and then APT33, and then you might want to combine the two adversaries, color code them so you can see where they are overlapping in tactics and techniques, but also where they're differing. And then on top of that, you could then take that and apply it against the defensive capabilities that you have, whether it be prevention or detection, and overlay that and identify the gaps. We can very quickly within Navigator search for specific data point, just like we did within the Mitre attack GUI. We can come in here, we can type in education, and it's going to grab us anything to do with the potential threat groups that are associated to education. So you can see 9 have been identified here. Software, any mitigations or data sources or campaigns that might be associated with it. We are actually going to do this scenario very, very shortly. Now, the other thing is, how do we keep score? So we want to make sure that we establish some scoring criteria that means something to us. It probably should align to a risk matrix that we have created internally. So you see in the example here, we're starting from 0 to 5, and the colors change according to the number that you provided. Now, the nice thing about Navigator is that when we're in there, we have the ability to very quickly look at the tactic, the technique. We can select, we can annotate, we can make sure that we're providing the context needed to understand what it is the adversary is leveraging here and make the notes accordingly. All right, now it's demo time. Let's jump in. This time it's going to be gap analysis for a specific threat. Let's get started. We're going to do some research here on a specific threat to get a better understanding. This happens to be a threat roundup by Cisco Talos that talks about the threats that they've seen over a period of time. You've got indications of compromise, registry entries, files and directories. You've got file hashes, and you can also pivot to see more IOC-based information as well. And they talk about coverage around product if it has an ability to mitigate or detect the risk. But here's the important piece, the Mitre attack framework. So what they've done is they've taken a specific threat and aligned it to the TTPs the adversary is using or that particular threat is using. Let's go ahead and import this into Navigator. This is locally installed on our machine, and we can see that there's a variety of tactics and techniques that are being leveraged. Persistence, privilege escalation, defense evasion, credential access, command and control, we've got collection and discovery. We've given this a score of 1. And we've given it a name. We've also included the write-up from Cisco Talos as well. So let's go ahead and import maybe some of the security capabilities that we might have in the organization. In this case, we're looking at secure endpoint, and you can see there's a collection of capabilities. Again, there's comments that are made here and varying nuance in regards to the sub-techniques and coverage, right? There's always going to be nuance here. And you can see the scoring here. We've actually used a low value of 1 and a high value of 3, and the colors correspond to that. We also have the ability to set the score on this particular threat as well, just like we did with the ransomware, the actual attack itself. And we give it a name, and again, any links that we might want to reference here as well. So let's shrink this up and just look at the core tactic and technique. And what we can do here is we can pivot, and we see comments in regards to the evaluation that was made in regards to how that tactic or technique was met. You can see that it's persistence, that's the tactic, and then the techniques and sub-techniques that are called out here. It's a nice way of pivoting from Navigator into Mitre Attack and get a better understanding of what tactic and technique and sub-technique that we're investigating here. Let's go back here. Let's pivot into the technique itself. And you can see here, logon auto start execution also has 14 sub-techniques, specifically registry run keys. Startup folder is one that we're looking at here, and it gives us all the details, procedure examples, any mitigations that could be available to this, and any references that might also be available. Again, the more we know, the better that we can either prevent the adversary from being successful or have the ability to detect it. Something might be compromised within the environment, and obviously look at mitigating controls elsewhere in the environment. Again, the more we know, the better that we can detect a threat that may be ongoing within the environment. Also prevent the threat, potentially with this technique or upstream. Because remember, there's a collection of capabilities that they're going to leverage in order to be successful. And we may not be able to mitigate this one specifically, but other areas within the attack chain, we certainly could. Okay, now that we have a good understanding of how we might mitigate or detect, as well as what the adversary is using, let's overlay them and look at the missing pieces. So we're going to look at A, which is the ransomware, overlay it with the secure endpoint capability, and anything that's left that's not covered by B, we're going to identify here. Now, this is a quick way of understanding our overall risk, because we're going to see any tactics and techniques that we may not have coverage for with this specific analysis. Now, remember, we might have other products in line that help mitigate risk. And in fact, there's a couple things. If we look and pivot back, we can see there is 3 items that aren't covered, some of which, in fact, could be covered and maybe weren't identified in our original analysis of the secure endpoint, or they might be mitigated through other capabilities within the organization. So if we look at communication through removable media, if we disable, say, USB keys, then potentially we're going to mitigate that risk. And again, it calls out the mitigations and detections that are available for that particular tactic and technique. So that was command and control, communication through removable media. We also see a discovery with peripheral device discovery, and collection was also highlighted here as well as a tactic that was being leveraged. But we can grab the name, we can go ahead and name this new analysis of both the threat and the coverage and call this gap analysis based on when ransomware and the variant itself. And that way we can leverage this in a report where we highlight where our gaps are in the organization and the steps that we're going to take in regards to mitigating these tactics and techniques that do not have coverage. Now, we can also take a picture of this, and this could be built into our report. We can take this and apply it. So again, it's just a very quick way of getting a good understanding of the threat itself, very specific threat. It's not a group. It's not a campaign per se. It's a specific threat that has specific tactics and techniques that are associated to it. We apply that against our coverage model, and we get an idea of where the gaps are within the organization. All right, that was a specific threat. Now let's jump into an analysis for threat group APT33 and see how that aligns to our defensive capabilities. All right, we're in Navigator. That's locally installed on our asset. You can use the one on the website as well. We'll go ahead and set up the attack version 12, and we're going to use Enterprise. We'll give this a name. We'll call this APT33. And the goal here is to evaluate threat groups against the security capabilities that we may have in the organization and understand any gaps that may still exist. All right, let's do a quick search here for APT33. We can see it here very easily. We can view APT33 and pivot into Mitre, learn a little bit about the group, the tactics and techniques that are being leveraged by the adversary, the software. Again, all kinds of good details and references that we can refer to as well. I'm going to go ahead and capture that because I'm going to use that as part of the name and add a link. So let's go ahead and select APT33. I'm going to go ahead and set the score of 1, and we should see color of red or salmon. Let's go ahead and add a link to APT33 captured on Mitre. The label will be Mitre Attack, APT33 reference, and it looks pretty good. So these are the tactic and techniques that the group APT33 leverages when they are trying to compromise or take advantage of an organization. Now that we've got good insight into what tactics and techniques that they're going to leverage, let's go ahead and add our security capabilities. This is going to give us visibility into the areas of control, detect, or prevent in regards to the Mitre attack framework. Now you can see we've got a huge collection of capabilities. And as I mentioned before in other videos, there's nuance to this. There could be a subset of capabilities. How are these capabilities delivered? There's comments added here. That's what the yellow underscore is. There's comments that suggest what are the products that are delivering that outcome. But now we've got a good idea of our capabilities. We know how the adversary APT33 works. Now let's go ahead and look at the differences between A, which is APT33, and B, our capabilities that are providing preventative and detection capabilities throughout the organization. And check this out. We've got complete coverage. Now, this is a quick gap analysis against the threat group, a single threat group in this case, and our capabilities that align to the Mitre attack framework. What we can do now is give this a name, call it gap analysis APT33. We can put in a description and we can save this out. We might even want to put a date here. We can save this out and we can use this to provide a report to the team highlighting our coverage for APT33. Pretty cool. Let's do an analysis of threat actors targeting the educational vertical. And again, we'll overlay that with our defensive capabilities to identify the gaps. Let's get started. So we're on our local instance of Navigator. You can use the one on the web as well. We're going to go ahead and create a brand new layer. It's focused on Enterprise and we're using version 12. So let's go ahead and create that. We're going to go ahead and search right from Navigator. And we're going to look for everything that's got education in it. Now this is great because I can look at threat groups. I can look at software. I can look at maybe a technique. very, very quickly I can do a search and find anything related to that search criteria. Now here we see 9 threat groups that are targeting or have reference to education. Now you may want to go ahead and review them. In my case, I'm going to add them all. And what we're going to do here is we're going to give this a score of 1. You'll see the color change here. And now that we have this built out, let's go ahead and give it a name. Now a key element, this is point in time. So the threat actor, the tools they use, the tactics and techniques may evolve or change in regards to what they are using or not using. An attack may add, for example, new techniques. The bottom line is it's point in time, as well as your coverage model, right? What capabilities you have to detect and or prevent some of these tactics and techniques the adversary is using. So let's go ahead and overlay this with our capabilities, and let's determine where the gaps exist within our organization. Now, there's nuance in the coverage itself. And what I mean by that is that there may be a technique or sub-technique that has full coverage or partial coverage, and so there's nuance, and you want to drill into each one of these to understand that better. But if you built this coverage model based on your capabilities, then you have intimate knowledge of that. Now, the yellow underscore under each one of them just means that there is comments, and specifically here it talks about what products are achieving a specific outcome. So we're going to go ahead and give this a score of 2, and let's go ahead and add another layer. Now, this layer is going to compare A, which is our threat group, against our coverage model. So we're going to say anything that A is not found in B, then I want to highlight it. And you can see we've got some gaps here. We've got some reconnaissance, initial access, credential access, and discovery. Now, we may have already cut the adversary's legs off at the knees here. They may not be able to be successful based on the existing coverage that we have. But there is an opportunity for the adversary to evolve, and therefore we may want to look at some of these gaps and address them. So when we go back, let's go ahead and grab the name here, and what we'll do is we're going to give a description to our gap analysis that we just performed here. Gap analysis, give it a name. And we've got the date here as well. We might even want to include notes around the product that we have that's providing the coverage, or products. And remember, products are just capabilities. And we may now look at this and say, okay, now we've got all these gaps. How could we solve some of this? Or do we have coverage within the organization already? And so you can see here, this one's multi-factor authentication request generation. So the adversary uses and abuses the push notification within multi-factor authentication. And it's meant to, bombard the user with multiple push requests so they'd accept one of them and they get access. So they've already compromised that initial username and password, and they're now at the multi-factor stage here. So maybe we have coverage for that. So maybe one thing that we could do here is we can highlight that in our defensive capability mapping, we've got a gap, meaning we haven't highlighted this as a capability within our controls, whether that be detect or respond. And so we can highlight it here and make a note to say, look, we've got a gap in our product coverage mapping. We'll address that. We want to highlight it, but we do have coverage. Pretty quick and easy way to determine how you might fare against the adversaries that are targeting you. All right, now we're moving into adversarial emulation, verifiable protection. And this is just an example, but there's all kinds of tools that are available to do testing and simulation. Red Canary's Atomic Red Team is certainly one of those. You can run your test and do some validation. There's many different ways to perform sub-technique. So this is where there's a lot of nuance or potential nuance, but a lot of variations to identify potential opportunities to either detect or prevent. You got Caldera from Mitre, which allows us to do a coordinated series of steps when mimicking the adversary. And there's a couple others that are called out here, but the bottom line here is the ability to emulate the adversary within the environment to get a good idea of what might be happening. Caldera is from Mitre, certainly something that you may want to look at. There's a project that's actively being supported. You have plugins like Red Canary's Atomic Red Team. You have training, both red and blue teams, and it integrates with the Attack Navigator, which is neat. All right, let's do a simple example where we just want to identify or see some of the outcomes when acting as an adversary and leveraging a certain tactic or technique. All right, we're in Caldera. We can see we have a couple of agents, but we're going to jump right to adversaries. We're going to create a profile. We're going to give it a name. And this is going to be focused on Linux only. So Red Team Miners is the profile name. We'll go ahead and give a profile description here, and we'll call it the same thing. And we'll go ahead and click Create. We'll go ahead and add an ability. Now this ability is going to focus on the tactic of impact and the technique of T1496, which is resource hijacking. The ability is that crypto Monero mining. There's some specifics here called out. All we have to do is save and add, and we're ready to go. We can save the profile, jump into operations, create the operations, and execute this ability. So let's go ahead and give the operations a name. We'll call it Red Team Crypto Monero Mining. We'll go ahead and add the adversary capabilities that we just created. And we'll do base 64 and we'll go ahead and start. Now this is going to execute right away. It's going to, the agents obviously talk back to the C2 server, which is this box here, and it's going to go ahead and try to execute this command. So you can see the obfuscated command there, and then you see the actual output, and you can see this one failed right away. So it reached out. It looks like it did get connected. It looks like it pulled the file. Let's see, and it was killed right away. Okay, so there's defensive capabilities within the environment, and therefore we may see partial pieces of this tactic or technique depending on the technologies that we're leveraging. But we'll check that out in a moment here. We can see this one here is showing success to some degree. We're not seeing that process being killed. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into Secure Endpoint and check this out. So go into Events, and there we go. We can see a bunch of tactics that have been triggered here. Now, again, it depends on the technology and the capabilities on what tactic or technique has actually been discovered. So you can see resource development. You can see the tactic of user execution of malicious image. And it talks specifically about that. We can pivot into Mitre, etc. And then it talks about this tactic also was executed, and it gave it a high rating, and it was based on the Cloud IOC. Now, we can pivot right into this. If, say, for example, we've done some analysis and we need to either mitigate, add a control somewhere, we can drive that outcome from here. Or if we had to do additional analysis, so jump into, a sandbox environment and get a little bit better perspective of the actual payload itself and some of the outcomes. So we can do that, or we can jump right in and investigate this and get a relational view in regards to all the pieces that may be involved here. So better context in regards to the threat within our environment. And so you can see we've got a couple of targets here based on that SHA that has been identified as malicious. We've got file names. We've got clean SHAs, clean processes, and there's a little drop down arrow on each one of these items, and we can actually take action, do additional investigations from here, but get a better understanding of what's taking place. In this case, let's assume we know what's going on, and we can go ahead and take action against that endpoint if, for example, it wasn't fully mitigated. So maybe we want to take a forensic snapshot, isolate the asset, etc. So again, just driving that response right from SecureX. All right, let's do a drill down on the endpoint itself. So we looked at it more from a holistic view outside of the endpoint. Let's deep dive into the endpoint. And you can see here we've got the tactics and techniques that were called out in the earlier event screen that we were looking at. We can obviously pivot and learn more here. But you can see the yellowish, orangey, green color there that's highlighted. That's because an IOC was triggered. And the details around each one of these events. So we can see command line parameters, all the other associated compromise or events that may have taken place on that particular asset. Again, giving us better context overall. We can isolate the asset from here, take a forensic snapshot, drive those outcomes. Now, let's jump back into Caldera, and we can see here the debrief. So this breaks down, we've got our C2 server, any specifics around it, and then we've got those two agents that are running the Caldera agent that's doing that connection back to us to allow us to control that asset. And you can see the agents that we've got deployed on those endpoints that are communicating with the C2 server. You can see the steps here based on the adversary we're emulating, and we can see the show commands here. We can also see the tactics and techniques. So 1496, resource hijacking. Again, depending on the outcomes on the endpoint, you may see other tactics and techniques triggered on that technology stack that you might own. And then here you've got a legend and a breakdown of the components. The technique is called out here as well. Now, let's jump into IDS in place here. Let's just see if we've seen some things that took place when we actually ran that attack on those particular endpoints. And we see two intrusions. It says would have blocked. We can see the ports, the geolocation of the destination country. You can see potentially unwanted software or application, cryptocurrency mining pool connection attempt. And so the file traversed the next generation firewall. There's no malware inspection on this particular rule because we didn't want to block it, but it did see a connection attempt from it, and it would have blocked it if this was actually enabled. So this is all about the layers. Even if the adversary was able to get the payload inside and executed, they may not have been able to establish a connection. We can also see the payload details as well. That's captured by default, so there's no need to turn on packet capture after an event. It's already there, and that's important, especially when some of these events are a one-time event. Anyways, pretty cool stuff. Understanding the pyramid of pain and where the opportunities are for defenders. Higher in the pyramid makes it very difficult for the adversary. So lower levels address the symptoms, higher levels address the problem. Mitre ATT&CK is a framework that focuses on the adversary's behaviors and how they achieve an outcome. Mitre ATT&CK Navigator provides teams with insight in regards to TTP coverage and provides a gap analysis. Now, open source and commercial tools are enhancing their capabilities and aligning to attack. Defenders must be persistent and advanced when building out all aspects of defense: detection, prevention, and response.